dear colleague, it's a great pleasure and honor to participate in the Sérgio Mascarenhas Simpósio. I didn't have the privilege of meeting Professor Mascarenhas, but as a countryman, I can definitely get inspired by all the fantastic work that he did as a physicist and a scientist in Brazil. And he is definitely a source for great inspiration. He is actually one of these great examples of what happens when somebody who's not contaminated by dogmas and doctrines, like many of us physicians, get to see what you do. Since he wasn't strict by some of the medical knowledge that actually needs to be challenged, he could come up with principles and ideas that I think are changing our field. And this is the title of this short talk. You have had great talks from people that are working with much more related clinical aspects of this technology. But I really think you are now entering this new era where we are entering, as Carlos Bremer likes to say, the intracranial pressure waveform land, right? And this does represent a paradigm shift in neurocritical care. So in terms of the current labeling of this device in the United States, the Brain for Care system is intended for the monitoring of variation of intracranial pressure in patients with suspected alteration of intracranial pressure or change in intracranial compliance. And I think that's the key aspect, intracranial compliance. The system does so by providing surrogate ICP waveforms and associated parameters, including the estimated P2P1 ratio, the normalized time to peak, derived useful ICP pulses and cardiac pulses for the interpretation of the physician who should look at this in conjunction with all the clinical and imaging data before making a final interpretation. We are seeing an evolution in the ICP monitoring technology. When we started doing this a couple of decades ago, we were essentially looking at the mean absolutely ICP number, and we will discuss why that was a very limited process. We then start to look at trends. Finally, we start to have better monitoring devices that allow us to better, through at least visual interpretation, look at the waveforms. But one of the main limitations of all these devices being related to the high degree of invasiveness. You require either a placement of an ICP bolt or a ventriculostomy catheter. And as you all know, they all have their limitations and risks, and they lost accuracy, specifically the bolts, over time. We are now breaking this new era where even though you don't quite have an ICP number, we have a very accurate description of the ICP waveform and all these other associated parameters in a known waveform. And this is what the Brain for Care technology brings into place. The other key aspect of this technology is the incorporation of AI. So while many people see the Brain for Care as a device, I think the biggest strength is actually in the AI enriched software that actually helps us understand in the clinical context a lot more. And we will have a big utility, not only with the Brain for Care device itself, but potentially even with invasive ICP devices. We have seen a lot of evolution in other forms of healthcare monitoring, including EKG and blood pressure. We depart from something that was more simple to actually looking at more details. And now that you're entering the AI area, right, it's going to be a lot easier to look for patterns by looking at the minutiae of the data. And what is very complex with all these things is that you have so many points across time, right, that it's almost impossible for the human brain and the human eye to follow and recognize these patterns, at least in an easier and friendly format. So I think, again, we are looking at going beyond the device and incorporating what AI software you'll be able to do to us in terms of ICP monitoring. And in my opinion, I think this is what is the most promising intervention of this device. In general, I think we all have been very disappointed with what you have seen in terms of the benefit of treating intracranial hypertension crisis, right? The only randomized clinical trial that you have was by and large negative. The overall results have been, in general, pretty disappointing. And probably one of the reasons is it's probably easier and more efficacious to prevent the ICP crisis rather than treat an established crisis. And I think we may be able to start preventing the crisis if you depart from looking at the numbers and concentrate now on the waveform, which may be a better surrogate of ICP compliance. We are all familiar with the length fit curve. And as you know, during this phase 1 of the curve, there is this compensatory reserve, since we all have the ability to regulate CSF inflow and outflow, we can compensate for changes in volumes, right? During this initial phase, there is no changes in ICP. Right? Then you start to have phase 2, when you start to have more subtle changes, then we start to have changes in the ICP waveform, specifically the P2, P1, P2 ratio starts to change, the time to peak starts to change. And we now have the ability of observing this phenomenon, potentially even before the ICP crisis establishes itself, and will then be potentially more efficacious in terms of treatment here. So at some point, these compensatory mechanisms, they go through exhaustion, right? And then for any changing in volume, even low changes, we start to have very high changes in pressure. But then when you intervene, because that's typically what you do based on numbers, it may be too late. And this may be one of the reasons why, in general, our treatments for ICP have not resulted in as much outcome changes as you'd hope. We've seen this type of phenomenon with other surrogates and other measures in medicine. We all know the classic story with swan guns and all that, but as you get more and more refined and sophisticated, and I think as you look at large amounts of data over time, which you're only going to be able to do through this AI-derived software, we may be able to reach what you want, which is not only treat the patient, but rather to change the outcome of our patients. With that, I would like to thank you again for the opportunity, and I hope you all enjoy this wonderful day with Brain for Care. And once again, it's been an honor to talk about this topic at Professor Mascarenhas Symposium. Thank you.